When I was at university studying the history of biology, I was told by my professor that Paley and his argument of the watchmaker was disproven by Darwin and later by Dawkins, and I had no reason to doubt that. But then just in the last few years, as I've kind of been having an ongoing interest in biology, I thought I would look into this in a little more detail. And I was quite surprised to find out that when I read both Darwin and Dawkins, they had a lot of respect for Paley, first of all. And then I just wanted to kind of figure out how the watchmaker argument was dismissed. And first of all, let me just explain quickly what the watchmaker argument is. Really, more than anything else, it's an analogy. It's not an argument. It's taking two things that are alike and comparing them. And it goes like this. If you're walking along in a field and you come across a watch, you would immediately assume that somebody made that watch and that it didn't come there by accident. And in the same way, but only much more profoundly, life shows purpose and design. So it would seem that since life is in the universe, it must have had a watchmaker or a creator. And one of the things that I did quite early on in this was actually decide to read Paley, and I was quite impressed with the book. There are a few things that wouldn't be very convincing today. The jump from biology to theology is quite a big jump, and we wouldn't accept that. But his basic argument about this watchmaker and looking at design in life as evidence for the existence of God is something that was pretty convincing to me. So I went back and looked at Darwin and what Darwin had to say about this, and then I actually read the book that supposedly definitively refuted Paley, and that is Dawkins' Blind Watchmaker. So let me give you the reason that Darwin gave and then the reason that Dawkins gave for dismissing Paley's watchmaker analogy. So for Darwin, he was able to get around the appearance of design by simply saying that given enough time and just nature acting on living things, a very small number of organisms could change. And he called this natural selection. And he used a different analogy. He used the analogy of breeders and how they were able, from one or two different kinds of dogs, create all kinds of different dog species, or dog kinds, if you like. And he used pigeon breeding and horse breeding and all these things as examples of how artificial selection could create all this variety. How much more over a vast period of time could natural selection do the same thing? Dawkins took a similar slant to that, and he used the example of, or one of the examples he used in his book was the example of sonar. And it began quite primitive, simply a few pings to hear or see underwater submarines, but that technology developed over time and became more and more sophisticated. And he said in the same way, nature does that. But the thing that both Darwin and Dawkins failed to see is that Paley had first of all addressed this right from the very beginning of his book. He had said that if you could find a law that would explain how life came to be in all its complexity and variety, that would not solve the problem. Because now, instead of having a watchmaker, you had a lawmaker. And a law cannot be in place unless there's someone to give it. And if there is no power behind that law, then it's useless. So that even if you could create a law that led to the development of a watch, that wouldn't change anything. And the other thing he refuted was this idea that just because life reproduces itself, that in itself does not answer the problem, because it only makes the problem more difficult. He said how amazing it would be if a watchmaker was able to fashion a watch in which it could reproduce itself. This doesn't solve the problem. So the arguments that both Darwin and Dawkins make against Paley are really already addressed in his book. And that was before the theory of evolution or Dawkins ever came along. So, but if we look more closely at the idea of natural selection and solving the problem, it really doesn't solve any problem at all. Because in order for you to have natural selection, you have to have something to select upon. Darwin could say, oh, look at all the variety of dogs that came from one single species of let's say, a primitive wolf. But the reality is that you're still dealing with a wolf. And while there can be many different kinds within that wolf or dog kind, the reality is that they all trace back to one ancestral wolf, and that you are still left with explaining the wolf. One author said that Darwin doesn't really describe Darwin describes not, he may describe the survival of the fittest, but he doesn't describe the arrival of the fittest. And so that was the weakness in Darwin's thinking. The other problem is, of course, if you're looking at artificial selection, you're looking at human agents, and they are looking at purposefulness. One may want to have a very small dog, and so they breed the dog until it gets smaller and smaller, but there's an intent or purpose behind that that drives that. And the selection is intelligent, causative. It has a purpose. And likewise, you know, if you want a larger dog, the same thing applies. So really, there is intelligent cause in the variety of dog animals we see. And with Dawkins, the picture, he uses sonar developed over a history of years and how it was improved upon. Again, we are looking at agents involved in that improvement. They are not blind. They are not without purpose. There is still very much a watchmaker in the development of sonar technology. Other evolutionary biologists have used the example of different kinds of cars and vehicles over the years. But again, that evolution is very much directed and purposeful. And one of the things that both Darwin and Dawkins wanted to prove is that without purpose, we could arrive at the abundance of life we see around us. And that really is not clear at all from what we see. In fact, I would say without any hesitation that history has vindicated Paley, and that if you were to look at the discoveries in biology, you cannot find this purposelessness. You can't find the disordered beginnings of life. Back when Darwin was imagining the origins of life, he imagined a small warm pool where the basic building blocks could be brought together to form a cell, and then from those few cells all life could evolve. But the reality is that since Darwin's time, we found and discovered that, quite contrary to his idea and fairly those of his time, cells are not simple little blobs, but they are themselves made up of complex proteins and carbohydrates, and so they could not easily form in a warm pool. So that's just some thoughts on Paley and the design argument, one that I think is still strong and valid for today. And hey, thanks for listening.